February 14, 1943. The sky above Kahili airfield, Bougainville. A formation of 12 Corsairs from Marine Fighting Squadron 124 climbed through thin Pacific clouds, their inverted gull wings catching morning light like bent steel. The pilots, fresh from stateside training, scanned horizons they barely understood. Below them, a ribbon of B-24 Liberators droned toward the Japanese-held runway. The escort mission seemed routine, textbook even, until the Zeros came. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. They dropped from altitude like stones, sleek and silver, their silhouettes impossibly graceful against the equatorial sun. The Japanese pilots had been watching, waiting. They had heard rumors of this new American fighter with the strange wings and brutal engine, the one the Navy had rejected, the one deemed too dangerous for carrier decks. The Corsair. To Japanese eyes, it appeared awkward, heavy, a brute masquerading as a thoroughbred. Some officers had laughed when intelligence briefings described it. A fighter that killed its own pilots in training. A plane so unstable the Americans relegated it to land bases because it couldn't land on ships. Surely, they thought, this was desperation, not innovation. The engagement lasted minutes. When the smoke cleared, 8 American aircraft had fallen, 2 of them Corsairs. The Japanese lost perhaps 3 fighters. The Marines would remember it bitterly as the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But mockery, like smoke, dissipates when wind changes. Within 6 months, that same Corsair would achieve something no Japanese pilot anticipated. An 11-to-1 kill ratio. Over 2,000 victories against fewer than 200 losses. The highest success rate of any Allied fighter in the Pacific War. This is the story of how laughter turned to terror, how a rejected pet fighter became the most feared machine in the Pacific sky, how Japanese officers who once dismissed the bent-wing bird learned to call it by another name, Whistling Death. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Corsairs' origins lay not in romance but in cold mathematics. In January 1938, the United States Navy Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request that bordered on impossible. They wanted a single-seat fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, with a range of 1,000 miles, armed with at least 6 machine guns, and able to operate from aircraft carriers. No existing fighter came close. Most American naval fighters in 1938 struggled to reach 300 miles per hour. The Navy wasn't asking for incremental improvement. They were demanding revolution. Chance Vought Aircraft, a company with more ambition than resources, accepted the challenge. Rex Beisel, their chief engineer, understood that conventional solutions wouldn't suffice. If they wanted unprecedented speed, they needed unprecedented power. The answer arrived in the form of Pratt & Whitney's R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, 2,000 horsepower, the most powerful aircraft engine in America at that moment. But power brought problems. An engine that massive required an equally massive propeller to absorb its output, 13 feet, 4 inches in diameter, larger than any propeller ever mounted on a fighter aircraft. The challenge became immediate. How do you give a 13-foot propeller ground clearance without creating landing gear so tall the aircraft becomes unstable? Beisel's solution was elegant and strange in equal measure. He bent the wings. The inverted gull wing design became the Corsair's signature. The wings dropped sharply from the fuselage, then leveled off, toward the tips. This configuration allowed the landing gear to remain relatively short, while the propeller sat high enough to clear tarmac and carrier decks. Engineers worried the design would create excessive drag or unpredictable handling. Test pilots worried it would make the aircraft too complex to maintain under combat conditions. Navy officials worried it was too radical, too different from proven designs. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman Bullard lifted the prototype into Connecticut sky. The XF-4U-1 climbed smoothly, its massive engine pulling it through air with authority that stunned observers. At 7,000 feet, Bullard opened the throttle fully. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, 410, 415. When he landed, engineers swarmed the aircraft, checking instruments, verifying readings. The Corsair had just become the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Navy ordered production immediately, 584 aircraft, delivery to begin in 1942. Victory seemed inevitable. The Corsair would dominate Pacific skies, clearing the way for bombers and amphibious assaults. Japanese fighters, already struggling against American industrial might, would face a weapon beyond their capacity to counter. Except the Corsair had secrets, dark ones. The first production F-4U-1s began arriving at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in July 1942. Pilots climbed into cockpits positioned 3 feet farther aft than in any fighter they'd flown. The reason was practical. Fuel tanks sat between cockpit and engine, but the consequence was severe. Forward visibility vanished. During taxi, pilots couldn't see where they were going. During landing approach, the long nose blocked any view of the runway or carrier deck until the final seconds before touchdown. Then there was the stall. At slow speeds, particularly during carrier approaches, the Corsair's left wing would drop without warning. Not gradually, suddenly, violently. The massive torque from the engine and propeller created uneven airflow over the wings. If a pilot added power during an aborted landing, the aircraft could snap roll onto its back before he could react. At low altitude, there was no recovery, only water and silence. Training accidents mounted. At Marine Corps Air Station Mojave, 144 Corsairs were damaged or destroyed during training. Young pilots, fresh from flight school, found the aircraft unforgiving. It demanded precision, experience, caution. Everything war doesn't provide. The nickname emerged quickly, Ensign Eliminator. The bent-wing Widowmaker. Pilots whispered it during pre-flight briefings, half joke, half prayer. In October 1942, the Navy conducted carrier trials aboard USS Sangamon. The results were catastrophic. Poor visibility led to hard landings. The stall characteristics caused multiple accidents. The tailhook system proved unreliable. After 2 weeks of testing, Navy brass made their decision. The Corsair was unsuitable for carrier operations. It would not deploy aboard fleet carriers. The dream of a revolutionary carrier fighter died in smoke and twisted metal on Sangamon's deck. But war doesn't pause for disappointment. In the Solomon Islands, Marines were dying. The campaign for Guadalcanal had exposed brutal truths about American fighter capability. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, stalwart and reliable, couldn't match Japanese Zeros in speed or range. Marines needed something better, something that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return, something that could fight Zeros on equal terms. The Marine Corps, operating from land bases rather than carriers, didn't face the same landing constraints as the Navy. Runways were longer, approaches more forgiving. If the Corsair couldn't land on ships, it could land on islands. In December 1942, the first Corsairs were crated and shipped to the South Pacific. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, commanded by Major William Geese, would introduce the bent-wing bird to combat. The Japanese, meanwhile, had built an empire on air superiority. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0, had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Light, agile, capable of outturning any Allied fighter, the Zero represented Japanese design philosophy perfectly. Spirit over steel, maneuverability over armor. The pilot's skill mattered more than the machine's brute force. In the Zero, Japanese pilots believed they flew the perfect expression of Bushido, the way of the warrior, translated into aluminum and silk. When intelligence reports described the new American fighter, Japanese officers studied the specifications with interest and skepticism. Heavy, 4.5 tons empty weight, nearly 8 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Zero, 6 50-caliber machine guns, thick armor, plating. Self-sealing fuel tanks. The Americans, it seemed, were building tanks with wings. Slow, cumbersome, lacking the grace that defined proper fighter design. Some Japanese pilots openly mocked the reports. A fighter that couldn't land on carriers? What kind of naval air force builds aircraft unsuitable for ships? The Americans must be desperate, throwing anything into the sky and hoping for results. The Corsair, they concluded, would be easy prey. Fast in a straight line, perhaps. But war happened in turns, in close quarters, in the chaos where agility meant survival and weight meant death. They would learn otherwise, but learning would cost them the sky. On February 12, 1943, 12 F-4U-1s from Marine Fighting Squadron 124 touched down at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The airstrip, carved from jungle and coral, bore scars from months of combat. Wrecked wildcats lined the perimeter. Shell craters pocked the runway. The air smelled of aviation, fuel, mud, and the sweet rot of tropical heat. Major G's assembled his pilots. They'd flown from the jeep carrier Kitty Hawk to Espiritu Santo, then north to Guadalcanal, 9 hours in the cockpit for some. Already they had an assignment. No time to acclimate, no time to scout the territory. The war needed them immediately. Among the pilots stood First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, 36 years old, former enlisted man, one of the few Marine aviators qualified as an aircraft carrier landing signal officer. Walsh had been flying since 1936, longer than most of his squadron mates had been in the service. He understood machines, respected them, but he also understood that respect didn't guarantee survival. Walsh walked the flight line that afternoon, inspecting his assigned Corsair. Bureau number 02350. The aircraft sat low on its landing gear, nose pointing skyward, propeller blades casting long shadows across packed earth. He ran his hand along the inverted gull wing, feeling rivets, checking control surfaces. The machine felt solid. Heavy, yes, but purposeful, like a weapon that knew its job. The first mission launched before sunset, 12 Corsairs escorting a PBY Catalina on a rescue operation to Vella La Vella. The mission went smoothly. No enemy contact. But the flight revealed truths about the Corsair that training hadn't fully conveyed. At altitude, the aircraft felt powerful, stable. The R2800 pulled them through air with authority, but at slow speeds, particularly during the return landing, the machine demanded constant attention. The stall lurked like a predator, waiting for inattention. February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. The mission briefing came early. Escort duty for B-24 Liberators striking Kahili airfield on Bougainville, deep into Japanese-held territory. 4 hours round trip. Walsh and 11 other Corsair pilots joined Army P-38s and P-40s for the mission. 40 American fighters protecting 10 bombers. A strong force, surely overwhelming. But the Japanese had coast watchers too. Radio operators hidden on islands, tracking American formations, reporting movements. Zeros were waiting. They came from altitude, sun behind them, diving into the American formation with precision honed by years of war. The engagement was chaos. Tracers cut the sky, aircraft scattered, radios screamed warnings and curses. Walsh saw a P-38 explode, hit by cannon fire. A P-40 spiraled toward jungle, trailing smoke. A Corsair from his own squadron took hits and fell away, pilot struggling to control the stricken machine. Zeros slashed through the formation, their light frames and powerful engines allowing maneuvers the heavier American fighters couldn't match. Walsh fired at a Zero crossing his path. Missed. The enemy vanished into clouds. When the Americans limped back to Henderson Field, the tally was grim. 8 aircraft lost, 4 P-38s, 2 P-40s, 2 Corsairs, 2 Liberators. Japanese losses were minimal, perhaps 3, perhaps 4 zeros. An intelligence officer asked Walsh for his assessment. Walsh's answer was blunt. "We're not using the airplane right." The Corsair, he understood, wasn't built for turning dogfights. Its weight and wing loading made it sluggish in tight maneuvers below 300 miles per hour. The Zero could outturn it every time. But the Corsair had advantages the Zero couldn't match. Speed, especially in dives. Firepower. 6 50-caliber machine guns delivered 12 pounds of lead per second. Armor. The thick plating and self-sealing tanks meant a Corsair could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. The key, Walsh realized, was altitude. At high altitude, the Corsair's turbo-supercharged engine maintained full power, while Japanese fighters gasped for air. From altitude, American pilots could dictate engagement terms: dive, attack, climb, away. Never get slow, never get into turning fights. Use speed and firepower, not agility. The tactics were heretical. Fighter pilots since World War I had believed in the turning dogfight, but Walsh understood that doctrine meant nothing if you died proving it wrong. Over the following weeks, VMF 124 refined their approach. Pilots practiced diving attacks, boom and zoom tactics that exploited the Corsair's strengths. They learned to trust their armor, to press attacks knowing the aircraft could take punishment. They learned to fear slow-speed maneuvering, where the Zero's advantages became overwhelming. On April 1st, 1943, Walsh led a 4-ship flight escorting bombers over the Russell Islands. Japanese Zeros appeared, climbing to intercept. Walsh held altitude, watching, waiting. The Zeros focused on the bombers, committing to attack runs. Walsh rolled inverted and dove. Speed built, 600 miles per hour, 650. The airframe shook but held. Walsh's gun sight settled on a Zero, attempting to break away. He squeezed the trigger. 6 machine guns roared. The recoil jolted the cockpit. Tracers converged on the Zero's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Smoke erupted. The Zero rolled left, then nosed over, falling toward jungle below. Walsh pulled out of the dive, climbed back to altitude. 2 more Zeros crossed his path. He fired again. One exploded. The other disintegrated, wings folding, fuselage breaking apart. 3 kills on his first combat mission. Walsh returned to Henderson Field with his Corsair intact, fuel gauges reading near empty, gun barrels still hot. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting bullet holes in the armor, finding none that penetrated. The bent-wing bird had proven itself, not through agility, through power. By May 13th, Walsh had downed 5 Japanese aircraft. He became the first Corsair ace. The distinction carried weight. It meant the tactics worked. It meant the Corsair, properly flown, could dominate. Other pilots in VMF 124 began racking up kills. The squadron's confidence grew. They stopped fearing the Zero's reputation and started exploiting its weaknesses. Japanese pilots noticed the shift. Intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed growing concern. The new American fighter was faster than anticipated. Its guns were devastating. Zeros that survived Corsair attacks returned with extensive damage, fuselages riddled, wings shredded. Pilots described the sound of 50-caliber rounds hitting their aircraft, a metallic hammering, like roofers pounding nails, except each nail weighed nearly 2 ounces and travelled at 2,900 feet per second. The mockery faded. In its place came caution, then fear. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots began avoiding Corsairs when possible. They would attack other American fighters but break off when they identified the bent wings. The Corsair was earning its reputation, not quality, through propaganda but through the quiet accumulation of victories. Aircraft destroyed, pilots killed, missions aborted. The machine that couldn't land on carriers was rewriting the rules of Pacific air combat, and the war, indifferent to plans and expectations, was about to demand even more from the bent-wing bird and the men who flew it. The transformation didn't happen in declarations or proclamations. It happened in the cumulative weight of small battles, individual encounters where Corsairs turned Japanese confidence into wreckage. By August 1943, Marine squadrons across the Solomon Islands were receiving F-4U-1s in increasing numbers. VMF-2-14, the Black Sheep Squadron, formed under the command of Major Gregory Boyington. VMF-2-15, VMF-2-22. Each squadron brought fresh pilots eager to prove themselves, and veterans transferring from Wildcats, amazed at what the Corsair could do. Boyington was an unusual commander, 31 years old, stocky, with a face that looked like it had absorbed too many punches. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China, claimed 6 victories there, though the number was disputed. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and led with a charisma that inspired loyalty bordering on worship. His squadron was assembled from replacement pilots, orphans awaiting assignment, men who hadn't fit elsewhere. They called themselves the Black Sheep, poor little lambs who had lost their way. Boyington understood the Corsair intuitively. He'd flown enough aircraft to recognize when a machine matched its mission. The Corsair wasn't elegant, but elegance didn't matter in the Solomons. What mattered was firepower, range, and the ability to absorb damage. Boyington trained his pilots aggressively: altitude discipline, energy management, never get slow, never turn with a zero, use the dive, trust the guns. On September 7th, 1943, VMF-214 flew its first combat mission from the Russell Islands. The target was a Japanese convoy near Balal. Boyington led 12 Corsairs at 15,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range. Below, Japanese destroyers and transports crawled through azure water. Zeros circled above the convoy, expecting attack from bombers. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Boyington rolled into a dive. The other Corsairs followed. Speed built rapidly, 700 miles per hour. The airframes shook violently, instruments blurred. But the wings held. They always held. At 3,000 feet, Boyington pulled out, leveling off directly behind a Zero that hadn't seen him coming. 6 machine guns opened fire. The Zero's tail section separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled into the sea. The Black Sheep ripped through the Japanese formation, firing short bursts, climbing away before the remaining Zeros could react. In 3 minutes, they claimed 6 victories. 1 Corsair took hits but returned safely. Boyington's tactics were working, not because they were sophisticated, because they were brutally simple. Speed kills, altitude dominates, firepower ends arguments. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 4 months, VMF-214 would claim over 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged. Boyington himself would down 22 enemy planes flying the Corsair, bringing his total to 28 victories. The number made him one of America's top aces. But numbers told only part of the story. The real story was in what the Corsair represented: a shift in Pacific air combat from artistry to industrialized violence. The Japanese had built their air power on skill, on pilots trained extensively before combat, on aircraft designed for maneuverability and range. But by 1943, Japan's pilot training program was collapsing. Losses exceeded replacement rates. New pilots arrived in combat theaters with minimal flight hours, unable to match veterans like Walsh or Boyington. The Corsair accelerated this decline. Its firepower meant even inexperienced American pilots could down Japanese fighters. Its armor meant mistakes that would be fatal in a Zero were survivable in a Corsair. Japanese officers recognized the problem but lacked solutions. They couldn't match American production. In 1943, the United States produced over 80,000 aircraft. Japan produced 16,000. The disparity extended to pilot training, fuel supplies, maintenance capabilities. Japan was fighting an industrial war with artisan tools. The Corsair was one of those industrial hammers, mass-produced, reliable, devastating. By November 1943, the distinctive sound of the Corsair had become familiar across the Solomon Islands. The whistle. It came from air rushing through the oil cooler intakes located in the wing roots. At high speeds, particularly during dives, the intakes emitted a high-pitched moan, almost a scream. Japanese ground forces heard it first. The sound preceded attacks by seconds. Not enough time to take cover. Just enough time to know death was diving toward you at 700 miles per hour. The nickname emerged from multiple sources. Some claim it was Japanese pilots who first called the Corsair whistling death. Others attribute it to propaganda, to journalists seeking dramatic language. The truth likely lies between. Japanese forces certainly feared the Corsair. Captured documents described it as formidable, dangerous, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage. Whether they used that specific phrase is less important than the reality it described. The Corsair killed efficiently, and the whistle announced its arrival. Marine pilots embraced the nickname. They painted it on fuselages, mentioned it in letters home, repeated it during briefings. The psychology mattered. If the enemy feared your aircraft, you'd already won part of the battle. Walsh noticed it during missions in late 1943. Japanese fighters that once pressed attacks now broke away when they identified Corsairs. The Zero still had advantages in turning fights, but increasingly, Japanese pilots avoided those fights altogether. Better to survive and attack easier targets than die, proving your aircraft could turn tighter. Walsh's own combat record illustrated the Corsair's dominance. By August 19, 1943, he'd downed 20 Japanese aircraft. On August 15th, he faced one of his most harrowing missions. Flying combat air patrol over Vella La Vella, Walsh intercepted a formation of Zero fighters and Val dive bombers attacking American invasion beaches. He was outnumbered 6-1. Walsh dove into the formation anyway. His first burst destroyed a Zero. The second damaged a Val. Then 20mm cannon fire from an unseen Zero struck his Corsair. Shells punched through the starboard wing fuel tank. Others shredded control surfaces. Walsh pulled into a cloud, temporarily blinded as his gyroscopic instruments tumbled. He experienced vertigo, the sensation of falling while climbing, spinning while flying straight. When he emerged from the cloud base, Walsh found himself inverted, diving at 43 degrees, aimed directly at the crater of an extinct volcano on Kolombangara Island. Minimum altitude. No room for error. He rolled the Corsair upright and pulled. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. He fought consciousness, pulling harder. The Corsair responded, wings creaking, airframe groaning, but holding. Walsh missed the crater rim by feet. He flew the damaged aircraft back to base, fuel streaming from the punctured tank, hydraulic fluid coating the windscreen. Ground crew declared the Corsair a total loss, but Walsh walked away. The armour had absorbed hits that would have killed him in any other fighter. The self-sealing tanks had prevented fire. The massive radial engine had kept running despite damage. Walsh didn't love the Corsair, but he trusted it. Trust, in combat, mattered more than love. Japanese pilots faced the opposite situation. They loved the Zero but couldn't trust it to protect them. Zero pilots interviewed after the war described the psychological burden of flying an aircraft with minimal armour and unprotected fuel tanks. Every hit was potentially catastrophic. Every engagement risked immolation. American .50 caliber rounds didn't just damage Zeros, they disintegrated them. Fuselages split open, wings folded. Fires erupted instantly, consuming cockpit and pilot before bailout was possible. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest scoring ace with 64 victories, called the Corsair the most formidable American fighter. In his autobiography, Sakai described encountering Corsairs over the Solomons. Their speed made interception difficult. Their firepower made attacks suicidal. Their armour made them nearly impossible to down with single passes. Sakai, who survived the war despite losing an eye to gunfire, learned to avoid Corsairs when possible. An ace with decades of experience chose retreat over engagement. That alone testified to the Corsairs' impact. By late 1943, the Corsairs' role expanded beyond air superiority. Marine squadrons discovered the aircraft's capacity for ground attack. The 650 caliber machine guns could shred Japanese installations, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. The Corsair could carry external ordnance, bombs under the fuselage, rockets under the wings. It became a fighter bomber, equally capable of clearing skies and destroying ground targets. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, visited Marine Air Group 31 in May 1944. Though officially a civilian, technical consultant, Lindbergh flew combat missions, testing the Corsairs' capabilities. On September 3, 1944, he flew a Corsair, carrying 3 1,000-pound bombs, a total load of 3,000 pounds. He dropped this ordnance on Japanese positions at WWII Atoll. 5 days later, he delivered a 2,000-pound bomb, the largest payload yet carried by a single-engine fighter. Lindbergh's experiments proved the Corsair's versatility. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a weapons platform capable of delivering devastating strikes against hardened targets. This versatility would prove critical as the Pacific War shifted from air combat to ground support. The island-hopping campaign required close air support. Marines assaulting fortified positions needed aircraft that could destroy bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery emplacements. The Corsair delivered. During the Battle of Peleliu in September 1944, Corsairs flew continuous ground attack missions, bombing Japanese positions dug into coral ridges. The terrain was nightmarish. Caves honeycombed the hills. Japanese defenders had prepared for months, creating interlocking fields of fire, concealed artillery, and fanatical resistance. Marines advanced yard by yard, taking casualties at rates not seen since Tarawa. Corsairs became their salvation, striking targets infantry couldn't reach, breaking Japanese defenses that seemed impregnable. Pilots described the mission as exhausting and terrifying in equal measure. Ground attack meant flying low, exposed to anti-aircraft fire, unable to use speed and altitude for protection. Flak filled the sky. 20mm and 40mm shells burst constantly. Corsairs took hits. Some went down, trailing fire, crashing into jungle or sea. But most returned, armor-plated and resilient, scarred but flying. The statistics from 1944 told the story. Corsairs flew over 64,000 sorties. They dropped 15,000. 621 tons of bombs. 70% of all bombs dropped by American fighters during the entire war. Air-to-air, they claimed over 2,000 victories against fewer than 200 losses. The 11-to-1 kill ratio held. By any measure, the Corsair was succeeding beyond expectations. Yet success came with costs rarely mentioned in official records. Pilots who survived tours often returned damaged in ways armour couldn't prevent. Walsh, by war's end, had flown over 200 combat missions. He'd been shot down 3 times, survived crashes, lost friends. The stress manifested in tremors, nightmares, an inability to relax even when safe. Combat fatigue, the military called it. Shell shock. The names changed, but the reality didn't. War broke men gradually, invisibly, in ways that didn't show on medical reports. The Corsair couldn't protect against that. It could bring pilots home alive. It couldn't make them whole. Walsh understood this distinction. In letters, to family, he rarely mentioned victories. Instead, he wrote about weather, about boredom between missions, about longing for normalcy. The airplane, he noted once, did what it was designed to do. It killed efficiently. That efficiency was both blessing and burden. By January 1944, Major Boyington had become one of the war's most recognizable aces. 28 victories, Medal of Honor recipient. His Black Sheep Squadron had established themselves as elite. But on January 3, 1944, Boyington's war ended. During a mission over Rabaul, Zeros attacked his formation. Boyington shot down his final victory, then took hits. His Corsair caught fire. He bailed out over water and was captured by Japanese forces. Boyington would spend the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. He survived, barely, enduring starvation, disease, and abuse. After the war, he wrote about his experiences, about the Corsair, about what it meant to fly a machine so capable yet so demanding. His conclusion was simple. The Corsair wasn't the best fighter ever built, but it brought pilots home more often than any other aircraft in the Pacific. That, Boyington believed, was the only statistic that mattered. As 1944 progressed into 1945, the nature of the Pacific War transformed. Japan, facing inevitable defeat, turned to kamikaze tactics. Suicide aircraft loaded with explosives, flown by pilots trained only to die. The strategy was desperation masquerading as honor, but it was effective. Kamikazes sank dozens of Allied ships, killed thousands of sailors, and created psychological terror that conventional attacks couldn't match. The Corsair became crucial in defending against kamikaze attacks. Combat air patrols orbited constantly around fleet formations, intercepting incoming attacks before they reached ships. The Corsair's speed allowed it to catch suicide aircraft. Its firepower guaranteed kills even with brief firing opportunities. During the Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945, Corsairs shot down hundreds of kamikaze aircraft. Marines defending Okinawa gave the Corsair another nickname, Angels of Okinawa. Ground troops, pinned by Japanese artillery and suicide attacks, watched Corsairs dive through flak to strike enemy positions. The bent-wing birds seemed omnipresent, overhead constantly, their whistle announcing relief. Infantry who survived Okinawa remembered the Corsair more fondly than any other aircraft. It had kept them alive when nothing else could. On June 22, 1945, Walsh, who had returned to combat with VMF 222, scored his 21st and final victory. A Zero, attempting a kamikaze run. Walsh intercepted at high altitude, dove, fired a short burst. The Zero exploded. Walsh felt no satisfaction, just relief. Another ship saved. Another pilot prevented from dying pointlessly. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Corsairs' combat record was undeniable. 2,140 air combat victories, 189 losses to enemy aircraft, kill ratio of 11.3 to 1, lowest loss rate of any fighter in the Pacific War, over 64,000 combat sorties flown, 3,499 Corsairs lost total, including accidents and ground fire. But of those lost to enemy fighters, the ratio remained overwhelming. The statistics failed to capture the human dimension. Kenneth Walsh survived the war. He flew in Korea, shot down a MiG-15, retired as a lieutenant colonel. He lived until 1998, dying at 81. He rarely spoke publicly about the war. When pressed, he would say, "The Corsair was reliable." That was his highest praise, reliable. Gregory Boyington survived prisoner of war camps, returned home, struggled with alcoholism and celebrity. He died in 1988. His memoir described the Corsair as brutally honest. It didn't lie about its capabilities. It didn't pretend to be graceful. It was what it was. A weapon designed to kill and to bring its pilot home. Sometimes it succeeded at both. The Japanese perspective came later, through memoirs and interviews conducted decades after the war. Sakai, the ace who feared the Corsair, wrote extensively about it. He acknowledged that Japanese fighter doctrine, emphasizing maneuverability over speed and firepower, had become obsolete by 1943. The Zero represented perfection of a philosophy. The Corsair represented industrial pragmatism. In a war of attrition, pragmatism won. Other Japanese pilots described the psychological impact of facing Corsairs. The whistle was mentioned repeatedly, not as myth but as memory. The sound meant incoming fire, meant death diving from altitude, meant no escape. Ground forces interviewed after the war confirmed this. The Corsairs' whistle preceded devastation. It became Pavlovian. Hear the sound, seek cover, die. Anyway. The mockery from February 1943, the dismissive assessment of a heavy, carrier-rejected fighter, had transformed completely by war's end. Japanese intelligence reports from 1945 described the Corsair as one of America's most effective weapons. Captured documents recommended avoiding engagement when possible. When engagement was unavoidable, Japanese pilots were instructed to attack only with numerical superiority and from advantageous positions. In other words, don't fight fair, because in a fair fight, the Corsair won. After the war, the Corsair continued flying. It served in Korea, primarily in ground attack roles, though it scored air-to-air victories against North Korean aircraft. Navy Captain Jesse Fulmer, flying a Marine F-4U-5, shot down a MiG-15 in September 1952, a propeller-driven fighter from World War II destroying a jet. The achievement symbolized the Corsair's enduring capability. Production continued until 1953, 12,571 Corsairs built total. They served with multiple nations. France flew them in Indochina. Argentina, El Salvador, and Honduras operated them into the 1960s. The final combat mission flown by a Corsair occurred during the football war between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969, 24 years after World War II ended. Today, fewer than 30 Corsairs remain airworthy. They appear at air shows, their radial engines roaring, their distinctive whistle audible to crowds who've never heard it in anger. Old men, now in their 90s, watch them fly and weep, not from sadness, from memory, from the recognition that they survived when so many didn't. From gratitude to a machine that, despite its flaws, brought them home. The Corsair's legacy isn't romantic, it's practical. It didn't win the war through elegance or superior dogfighting. It won through reliability, firepower, and the simple mathematics of survival. 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost. That ratio, sustained over thousands of missions, changed the Pacific War's trajectory. Japanese air power, once dominant, became negligible. American bombers flew with impunity. Amphibious assaults proceeded with air cover that Japanese forces couldn't contest. The bent-wing bird that couldn't land on carriers ended up reshaping naval aviation. By late 1944, after British Royal Navy pilots developed curved landing approaches and improved techniques, the Corsair began operating from American carriers. The problems that seemed insurmountable in 1942 had been solved through persistence and innovation. The Corsair became what the Navy originally wanted, a carrier fighter, just 3 years late. But those 3 years fighting from land bases had proven something more important. Location didn't matter. Ship-based or island-based, the Corsair dominated. It adapted to its environment rather than requiring the environment to adapt to it. That flexibility, that capacity to excel despite limitations, defined the aircraft's character. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Japanese officers who mocked the Corsair in 1943 learned their lesson in blood and wreckage. The heavy fighter they dismissed as desperate improvisation became their nemesis. The whistle they heard in their final moments became legend, and the aircraft that couldn't do what it was designed to do ended up doing something better. It survived. It killed. It won. Some machines transcend their specifications. The Corsair was never the fastest fighter, never the most maneuverable, never the easiest to fly, but it was there, over the Solomons and Okinawa, over Peleliu and Iwo Jima, every day, every mission, reliable, deadly, unflinching. The laughter stopped in February 1943. By August 1945, only the whistle remained, and in that whistle, carried on Pacific wind across islands and water, was the sound of inevitability, the sound of American industrial power translated into bent wings and radial engines, the sound of death whistling its approach, The Japanese learned to fear it, the Marines learned to trust it, and history recorded the result, 11-1, over and over, until the war ended and the skies went quiet. The Corsair did what it was built to do, not gracefully, but completely, and in war, that's the only thing that matters. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.